In the year 1565, the world watched in awe as a tiny island fortress stood alone against one of the greatest empires in history. Only 500 Crusader knights, armored in steel and faith, faced a sea of 40,000 Ottoman warriors. Cannon fire shook the walls, flames scorched the sky, and death seemed certain. Yet, against every law of war, they held. This is not just a story of courage. It's the story of how a handful of men turned Malta into a graveyard for an empire. The Ottoman Empire was at its peak under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. With territories stretching from the Balkans to Arabia, his armies were feared across continents. After crushing the Hungarians and threatening Vienna, his gaze turned to the Mediterranean and the Knights of St. John, exiled from Rhodes, now entrenched on Malta. To the Sultan, these Christian warriors were an irritation to be erased. As spring of 1565 dawned, preparations began for one of history's largest naval invasions. More than 200 ships assembled, carrying elite janissaries, artillery, and seasoned commanders. The Grand Vizier promised Suleiman that Malta would fall in weeks. But far to the west, Grand Master Jean Parasot de Valette sharpened his sword and his resolve, knowing this would be their final stand. When word of the Ottoman fleet reached Malta, church bells rang across the island. Farmers abandoned their fields, and soldiers flocked to the fortresses. Only a few hundred knights and a few thousand Maltese stood ready to defend the island. But within their hearts burned something far stronger than numbers: faith, pride, and vengeance for Rhodes. Jean de Valette was 70 years old, but as fierce as any young commander. His scarred face told the story of a man who had fought for decades against Muslim corsairs and Ottoman fleets. He knew that Malta's survival rested not on walls or guns, but on unity and willpower. "We are the shield of Christendom," he told his men. "We shall not yield an inch." Valette divided his small force among 3 strongholds: Fort St. Elmo, Fort St. Angelo, and Fort St. Michael. He ordered every citizen capable of holding a weapon to join the defense. Women prepared bandages and melted lead for bullets. Priests blessed the cannons before battle. Malta was no longer an island. It had become a fortress of faith. In Istanbul, Suleiman's admirals laughed at the thought of 500 knights resisting their might. They called Valette a relic of a forgotten age. But when the wind filled the Ottoman sails and their black banners approached Malta, the laughter faded. The Lion of Malta was waiting, and he had turned the island into a trap. In May 1565, the Ottoman Armada appeared like a black horizon. Locals watched in silence as hundreds of ships surrounded their shores. Cannons boomed and smoke filled the air as the Turks began their bombardment. The ground trembled under each blast, but the defenders held their ground, returning fire with precision. The first assaults targeted Fort St. Elmo, the smallest yet most strategic fortress guarding the harbor. Ottoman commanders believed it would fall in days. For 30 continuous days, the fort endured relentless bombardment. Walls crumbled, towers fell, and the sea turned red with blood. Still, the cross of the knights flew defiantly above the ruins. Night after night, the knights rebuilt their walls with corpses and rubble. They refused to surrender even when only a handful remained. "If we fall," one knight said, "let it be upon a mountain of our enemies." Their courage stunned even the Ottomans, who began to realize this was no ordinary siege. After a month of brutal combat, Fort St. Elmo was barely standing. The defenders were exhausted, wounded, and outnumbered. Yet, when Valette sent word offering them withdrawal, they refused. "We will die here," they replied, "as soldiers of Christ." Those words became eternal in the annals of heroism. The final assault came at dawn. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers stormed the ruins, expecting little resistance. But the defenders fought like demons. Even as the walls collapsed around them, they charged with swords drawn, cutting down enemy after enemy until they were overwhelmed. When the last night fell, the fort was soaked in both blood and glory. The Ottomans captured the ruins but paid dearly. Over 8,000 of their best men lay dead. One commander murmured, "If all Malta is defended like this, we shall perish before we take it." The body of the fort's last commander was nailed to a cross and floated toward the other forts. Valette watched in silence, then whispered, "St. Elmo has bought us time." With St. Elmo fallen, the Ottomans turned their attention to the main fortresses. The bombardment resumed with greater fury, shaking Valette's defenses day and night. The Maltese citizens fought beside the knights, carrying ammunition, repairing walls, and treating the wounded. Children fetched water under cannon fire. Valette inspired his men through presence alone. He walked the walls amid explosions, blessing the defenders, urging them to endure. He reminded them that Europe was watching, that their stand could save thousands of lives beyond Malta's shores. His faith became a weapon more powerful than any cannon. Meanwhile, disease and hunger began to spread among the Ottomans. Their supplies dwindled and their morale faltered. What they thought would be a quick conquest had turned into a nightmare. Even the sea seemed to betray them as storms wrecked their ships. Unknown to the Ottomans, Malta's underground tunnels became secret lifelines. Wounded knights were carried through them. Food and ammunition were smuggled between forts. The defenders moved like ghosts beneath the battlefield, striking where least expected. It was as if the island itself fought back. Among the Maltese volunteers were fishermen, farmers, and craftsmen who fought with improvised weapons. They became heroes in their own right, ordinary men transformed into legends. They set traps, ambushed patrols, and dragged enemy soldiers into the darkness. One story tells of a single Maltese gunner who, even after losing both legs to cannon fire, continued loading and firing his weapon from the ground until he died. His name was never recorded, but his spirit echoed through every cannon shot thereafter. As the siege dragged on, the Ottomans unleashed a new terror, firebombs. Flaming projectiles rained upon the forts, turning night into an inferno. The defenders fought the flames as fiercely as the enemy. Smoke blackened the skies for days, and the island burned, yet Malta did not yield. Valette ordered the priests to carry holy relics through the streets, blessing soldiers and giving last rites to the dying. "God is with us," he declared, "for if he were not, we would already be ash." His words lifted spirits even as the walls crumbled. The Ottoman commanders began to quarrel among themselves. Some demanded a retreat, others urged another massive assault. But pride and vengeance drove them forward. They could not return to Suleiman without victory. By midsummer, the balance began to shift. Reinforcements from Sicily were rumored to be on their way. The Ottomans, desperate to end the siege before they arrived, launched a colossal assault on Fort St. Michael. Cannons roared for 3 straight days, and thousands of soldiers charged the breaches. The defenders fought hand to hand, turning every street into a battlefield. When the Ottomans finally broke through, Valette himself joined the fray, sword in hand, striking down enemies beside his men. His presence electrified the defenders, and they pushed the invaders back with screams of victory. The ground was littered with corpses, but Malta still stood. Word of the knight's defiance spread across Europe like wildfire. They had done the impossible. They had stopped the greatest army in the world. In Istanbul, news of the prolonged siege enraged Sultan Suleiman. He could not understand how 500 knights had resisted 40,000 warriors. He sent urgent orders for the commanders to finish the job or face his wrath. But the once proud army was now broken, weakened, and sick. Within the Ottoman camp, morale collapsed. Supplies ran out, tempers flared, and disease consumed thousands. Some soldiers deserted under the cover of night, while others refused to fight. Even their allies among the Corsairs began to lose faith. The Grand Master's spies learned of the chaos, and Valette seized the moment. "Now," he said, "we strike back." He launched daring night raids on Ottoman trenches, burning their cannons and killing commanders in their sleep. In early September, the Ottomans gathered what remained of their strength for one final assault. They believed one overwhelming attack would end it. Thousands of soldiers advanced under the roar of drums, their battle cries echoing across the island. But the defenders were ready. Cannons, muskets, and boiling oil rained upon the attackers. Every inch of ground became a slaughterhouse. The Ottomans broke through once, only to be driven back by knights wielding swords and torches. The air was thick with fire, screams, and smoke. When the sun rose, the Ottoman army was shattered. Their generals ordered retreat, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The great invasion of Malta had ended, not with conquest, but with humiliation. Days later, sails appeared on the horizon, the long-awaited Sicilian relief force. They found an island of ruins, smoke, and ash, but still standing. The exhausted defenders greeted them with tears and cheers. The war was over. The Ottoman fleet, once the terror of the Mediterranean, limped away in defeat. Out of 40,000 men, less than 15,000 returned. The sea that had brought them had become their grave. Malta, the tiny rock of faith, had repelled an empire. When word reached Europe, bells rang from Rome to London. The knights who survived were hailed as heroes. The name of Jean de Valette became legend, the man who turned 500 into an army of destiny. Malta was saved, but the cost was unimaginable. Thousands lay dead, and the island was scarred beyond recognition. The fortresses were piles of stone, and entire families were gone. Yet the survivors saw their suffering not as loss but as sacrifice. Valette wept for his fallen brothers, but thanked God for their triumph. He ordered the construction of a new city, Valette, named not after vanity but remembrance. "This city," he declared, "shall be a fortress for all eternity." Even centuries later, visitors to Malta can walk through those streets and feel the echoes of that siege, the clash of steel, the roar of cannons, and the unbreakable will of 500 souls. For the Ottomans, Malta became a scar that never healed. The defeat shattered their illusion of invincibility. Never again would they attempt such a massive invasion of Europe. The balance of power shifted, and the Christian world found new courage. Historians later wrote that the Siege of Malta was one of the turning points in European history. It proved that faith and strategy could overcome numbers and fear. It was a warning that even empires can bleed. Suleiman, furious and aging, died the following year. He never forgot Malta, calling it the stone that broke the sword of Islam. The Knights of St. John continued to guard the Mediterranean for centuries. They became symbols of courage, discipline, and sacrifice. Their motto, pro fide, pro utilitate hominum, for faith, for the service of humanity, became eternal. Every fortress, every church, and every monument on Malta stands as a testament to their stand in 1565. Even modern military historians study their defense, marveling at their tactics and unity under impossible odds. The legacy of Valette and his knights lives on, a reminder that true power lies not in armies or weapons, but in the heart of those who refuse to surrender. Centuries have passed, but the Siege of Malta remains one of the greatest epics of human endurance. The story of 500 Crusaders defeating 40,000 Ottomans is not a myth. It is proof of what conviction can achieve. Standing on the ramparts of Valette today, one can still feel their spirit in the wind, still hear the cannons echoing across time. They were ordinary men who achieved the extraordinary, defenders of faith, freedom, and civilization. The siege ended in 1565, but the legend never died. It reminds us that when courage stands firm, even the mightiest armies can fall. As the sun sets over Malta's golden stones, the story of 1565 whispers through its walls, a story of defiance, faith, and immortality. 500 men faced 40,001, not because of strength, but because they refused to bow. Their victory was not only for Malta, but for all who believe that courage can change history. If you found this story inspiring, remember, legends are not born, they are forged in fire. Subscribe for more tales where history comes alive, and let the spirit of the Knights of Malta remind us, even in the darkest hour, light will rise again.